The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on changing behavior through reinforcement strategies. I'm Laura Ferguson with the Kentucky Autism Training Center, and I'll be your presenter today. Feel free to ask questions or make comments at any point throughout the presentation by typing your question in the question box and clicking send. If you cannot see the question box, click on the orange box with the white arrow in the upper right corner of your screen to open the box area. I will be answering all questions at the end of the presentation. Also, if you're looking for your handouts, just make sure you look at your toolbox on the side and you'll see your handouts to go along with the PowerPoint. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for attending. All right, so today during this webinar, we will be taking a look at using reinforcement strategies to change behavior. And our goals for today are to lead with an understanding of those reinforcement strategies, to know how to identify those reinforcers, and also how to increase reinforcement to look at compliance. And when we talk about behaviors today, I want to talk about how we look at behaviors, and sometimes we always think about changing behaviors, and we think of that behavior word as inappropriate behaviors. But throughout the day, we're going to be talking about how to increase behaviors that we want to see, because as we think about behavior strategies and what we need to do when we see those inappropriate behaviors, we also need to think about how we can increase those behaviors we want to see and we want to encourage in clients, students, children, whoever we're looking at with these strategies. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about and we're going to look at throughout this presentation is what is reinforcement? You know, and oftentimes when we hear this word, we all have a different meaning of what it actually means. But when we're thinking about the reinforcement word and that what it kind of contains, reinforcement is a stimulus change that immediately follows a response, and it increases the future frequency of that type of behavior in those conditions. So a big kind of definition, but really what does that mean? That's anything that follows a behavior that makes a behavior more likely to occur. And a lot of times what we don't think about is we're reinforcing behaviors even when we don't know it. But if we want to look at reinforcement and try to use that in our everyday lives to change behavior, increase or decrease, we have to think about what are we doing for reinforcement? What are those reinforcement strategies we're using? And if I want to increase that behavior, how do I use it more often to make these behaviors more likely to happen? And if I want to decrease these behaviors, how do I limit these reinforcers? And then how do I use these reinforcers to change the behavior into something more appropriate that I want to see happen more often? So within that, reinforcement is the most widely and important used principle of applied behavior analysis, and it's the fundamental building block for the selection of those behaviors we want to teach. And reinforcement theory states that behaviors that are reinforced will be repeated, and behavior that is not reinforced is less likely to be repeated. So thinking about those behaviors that we want to change, as you guys have came today, probably with some behaviors in mind of whoever you're working with, whether it's your child or a student or a client, when we're thinking about that theory, we are thinking about, man, I would really like, for example, this individual to increase brushing their teeth. But then I would also like him to decrease engaging in, for example, tantrum behaviors. So if we're looking at reinforcement theory and we're thinking about how important it is at changing behavior, we really have to think about this theory that, if we want behaviors to be repeated, then those behaviors need to be reinforced. So that's how important reinforcement is at changing those behaviors and increasing and decreasing those behaviors, whichever we're looking at. So within that, we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about those positive reinforcements, because with positive reinforcement, it's when a response is followed immediately by the presentation of some type of stimulus, and as a result, similar responses occur more frequently. And what does that mean? That means presenting a reinforcer immediately following a behavior to increase the likelihood of that behavior occurring. So for example, if I want my child to start eating more broccoli, for example, then every time he eats a piece of broccoli, I give him a gummy bear. And so when I present him with that gummy bear in the future, that makes him eat more broccoli in the future. So I'm positively reinforcing that behavior of eating broccoli, which makes him more likely to eat broccoli in the future because I've reinforced that with a gummy bear, which is obviously being a reinforcer in that situation because it made the behavior more likely to happen. So when we're looking at positive reinforcement, when we're trying to think of behavior change and replacement behaviors for inappropriate behaviors, or when we're looking at behaviors we want to increase, we need to think about positive reinforcement. What are some things that we can use? And the one thing I often hear is that individuals talk about reinforcement and go, well, I don't want to give a student or a child or a kid something every time they do that. They should know what to do, or they should understand. And when we're working with individuals who may be developmentally delayed, a lot of times those individuals may not demonstrate that they're intrinsically motivated for things. And so we have to teach them, oh, when I do this, I can contact some type of reinforcement. So we have to think about using motivation to increase behaviors. So within that, we really need to think about, yes, I want to reinforce these behaviors early on, and then I can fade those out. Because as we know, when we're trying to start new behaviors, such as working out as adults, we need some reinforcement in our lives, right? We need things to kind of show us that it's working. But then, that sometimes tapers off, but it still keeps us going because we've been reinforced in the past. And then, we fade out that reinforcement later on. But as we are starting to teach new behaviors with individuals that we're working with or our own children, we have to think about first starting with those reinforcement strategies. Because all too often we think about, I just want this behavior to stop, or I just want this to not happen anymore, or I really just want him to brush his teeth or go to the bathroom. And we think about those things and we go, I just want it to happen. But we first have to look at, do I have some effective reinforcement techniques to use to increase or decrease those behaviors that I'm looking at targeting with my student or child? So within that, the first big step that we have to think about is understanding, how do we determine what is reinforcing? When we're looking at our clients, students, children, we have to think about that word reinforcing. And a lot of times people say, you know what, I've tried that. I've given them a token or a sticker or some type of, piece of candy every time, and he's still engaging in these problem behaviors, or he's still not, going to the bathroom every time I give that to him. Well, if we see that happening, then we truly haven't found something that's reinforcing to the individual. Because again, if we think back to the definition, positive reinforcement is every time if I give you something after a behavior, it makes the behavior more likely to happen. So if those behaviors aren't continuing to happen, then we're not using a reinforcer. So we really need to think about, how do we determine what is reinforcing to the client or student or child we're working with? So the first thing we can do is pretty easy. Observe the child, right? And here, when I say the word child, we can really look at any individual, whatever age range we're looking at. Looking at what activities, objects, food does the child choose when they're allowed in free choice area or settings. If we just walk into the kitchen, what does that individual gravitate towards? Do they like all salty foods? Do we need to take a look at those and try some of those out? Does he go towards objects or areas where bubbles are, or is this kid going to go straight to the computer and get on anything that has to do with Minecraft? Or is this individual going towards magazines and books? So taking a look at, what do they gravitate to in their natural environment? If there are no demands placed on them, where are they going to walk or go towards? So I can start to understand what is something that may be reinforcing to this individual. And so we have to take a look at that, because the big thing that we often do is assume those reinforcers. And then we think reinforcement strategies don't work when changing behavior. But we have to make sure first that we're understanding what is reinforcing. Then also we can say, are there certain phrases, gestures, and so on that seem to produce a pleasant response from a child? So looking at that social piece, are there things that others can do that are reinforcing to the individual? So every time I clap, or, is expressions and gestures, are they showing some type of pleasure on their face that we often see? Um, and then are there those self-stimulatory behaviors that the student or child may exhibit? Are there things they engage in, just such as twirling or flapping things in front of their face? Can we look at some reinforcers that may look like those types of self-stimulatory behaviors? For example, I had an individual I was working with, and I had a really hard time trying to understand what was reinforcing to this individual. Finally, one day in the natural environment, I just observed him, and he walked over and, loved to put his face in front of the air conditioning vent. And I was like, oh, maybe he loves some fans, some things that, spin and blow air on him. From then on, we got those things out, loved them, was reinforcing to the child. So it's really valuable to kind of observe them in that natural environment, and observing them with not a lot of demands in place, but taking a look at what do they gravitate to when no one else is around. The other thing we can do is, if we're working with individuals, our children, or um, individuals who can speak, then we can ask them, right? What do you like? And a lot of times when I'm talking to parents and professionals, I'll be like, what is your reinforcement system? And we assume that individuals understand that type of language and lingo, but we may just want to ask, what do you like? What do you do when you're at home? What do you do when you go to school? Take a look and asking those questions. That way they can tell us, hey, I love it, when I'm sitting over here, or I love it when I can look out the window, or I like it, when you come over and pat me on the back, or, give me a sucker. They may be able to tell us that. So if the individuals or children that we're working with, or our own clients can tell us, then ask them, right? They know more than we could ever kind of assume just by looking at the environment. The other thing we could do is we can do a type of menu. I was just doing this with some individuals last week. We tried to kind of observe them in the natural environment. The environment that they were in, they weren't kind of gravitating towards anything. So, we put some actual pictures on a board, and just presented it to them. We put photographs of those actual items right there on the board and saw what they selected. So that kind of gave them what we call like a little reinforcer menu, and allowed them to choose their reinforcers to show us what they enjoyed or liked. And so, and then it allows them to kind of see, oh, when I pick this picture, then they give it to me or take me to it. So then they establish that, oh, these are things that I can select in the future when I want to, or am allowed to, choose a reinforcer. The other thing we could do is we can also, and I do this a lot in school systems I work, or when I meet families for the first time, is use a type of reinforcer survey. You can have parents or others that play in roles in the child's life, or if you are a parent, having others fill out when they're in this environment, what do they love? And using that survey to generate ideas for new or novel reinforcers. The one thing that we know is that there's always something that is reinforcing to individuals we work with. Sometimes it may be sitting on a beanbag. Sometimes it may be, having beads in front of our face. But there are things that are reinforcing to individuals that we work with. And if you have individuals that can read the children or client or your child, have them check off what they like and also dislike. I always put that in here. And on this next page, I kind of showed you what a sample reinforcer survey may look like that I often send home. For example, it has, use a check mark to indicate what the child, may like. So kind of trying to decide those things. A lot of times people send items home like this that are open ended. And if you're thinking back to your own children or kids that you are very close to, you might have a hard time filling these out if it's just open ended. What does your kid like, right? You may have a hard time trying to decipher this and understand. So once you give a check mark of activities, they may be like, oh, yes, they do love to paint. Oh my gosh, I didn't even think to write books or stories. And that way, it can give you a new perspective of things to try. Because the one thing we want to do is to understand reinforcement, because again, we're thinking about overall finding these things out so we can change behavior. And whether that's increasing or decreasing those behaviors, we need these strategies so we can understand what we can use. And again, if we're thinking we're using these strategies but we're not changing behavior, then again, think back to reinforcement theory. We're not really using a reinforcer because it's not making a behavior more likely to happen. All right. So now that we've kind of thought about that, and those are some ways that you can think about how to determine what is reinforcing to an individual. And again, no matter the age, we can use those strategies to think about what are those reinforcers? What are those things I can use to change behaviors? And there's some other things that we have to think about with reinforcement, and I call these considerations. And we're going to go through some of these and talk about changing behavior as well. But when we're thinking about reinforcement, we have to think about the immediacy of it, right? So think about a child who we want to brush their teeth. So we send them in there. We're like, oh, let's just brush our teeth. Let's go through the motions. And then they brush their teeth, and we'll say, if you brush your teeth, then, you know, we show them maybe a picture, brush your teeth, then you get, Skittles. So we think we show them that, and then they can finish brushing their teeth and they don't get Skittles for 20 to 30 minutes later. One of the big considerations of reinforcement where we're thinking about using this to change behavior is you need to think about the immediacy of it. If I want to say reinforcement's effective, if I finally have a child walk to the car without falling to the ground, or I finally have an individual brush their teeth, or I have a child who comes and sits at the table for dinner, or I have a student who actually raises their hand without calling out, I want to immediately reinforce that behavior, because if I take a long time and then go, oh my goodness, excellent raising your hand, here you go, and give them the gummy bear, they won't have that understanding of what contacted the reinforcer. So we have to think about reinforcing that behavior immediately. So one of those considerations of reinforcement is the immediacy of it. The other thing we have to think about is that schedule. As we start with working with our child, our client, one of the things we think about is, I don't want to always freely be handing out reinforcement. This doesn't look like we want it to. Are they going to become dependent on it? And those are some of the questions I hear individuals asking when they're talking about reinforcement. I don't want to have to hand out these items or give high fives every time. And also, I don't want them growing up to be dependent upon those reinforcers. And that's good things to have in our mind, because one of the things we have to think about is, what is the schedule? When I start off with clients, with students, one of the things I always talk about is, when we're changing behavior, we need to give large amounts of reinforcement, right? Oh my goodness, you finally sat in the chair. Oh my goodness, you finally kept your hands down. I'm going to reinforce those behaviors often, because those are behaviors I haven't seen in the past. But then I'm going to gradually fade that out, right? Because I don't want you to become dependent upon, oh my goodness, every time you sit down, I'm going to hand you something, because then you become dependent upon that. So what we have to think about is, we have that schedule of reinforcement with high rates in the beginning when we want to change behavior, but then we fade those rates of reinforcement out so that we can look at a more common schedule of reinforcement, right? Thinking about us as adults, our schedules of reinforcement are every 2 weeks we get paid every month. We want to fade those out to look like it would in a classroom, in their work setting, whatever they're going towards and transitioning to. The other thing we have to think about is the amount. You know, a lot of times I hear in settings that, I don't want to use food as a reinforcer. I've determined from this child or this student or this parent that this kid loves gummy bears, but I don't want to use that all the time. And one of the things we have to think about is, we can play around with the amount, right? We can cut gummy bears into 5 to 6 pieces. We can, crumble Oreos up, so that we're not looking at, in order to, work with this individual for 2 hours, I'm giving him, a whole roll of Oreo cookies. None of us want to look at that scenario and kind of make that determination, but we can look at, I don't have to use all of it, right? I don't have to give you 25 minutes of Minecraft to sit with me at the table. I can look at the amount of reinforcement I'm giving you. And then we can play around with that, right? If I, for example, want a student to come and sit with me at a table and he sits down for the first time, I can then go, excellent sitting, and giving you, 5 minutes on an iPad, instead of, and then, you know, taking it away and then giving you work a little bit more and giving you a little bit more of iPad. But I don't have to think about, oh my goodness, I'm going to give you 25 minutes for 2 minutes of sitting. So we can play around with amount, but we can also look at, if for the first time he sits through a whole reading lesson, maybe I give you a little bit more to reinforce that behavior and differentially reinforce it, because you did a lot more than you had ever done in the past. So I want to really reinforce that behavior. So we can look at that through reinforcement. Some other things that we want to think about is we want to what we call pair ourselves with reinforcement. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the PowerPoint as well. But we want to be seen as the giver of all things good, right? I all too often see that reinforcement kind of comes through other people saying, go over there and get that, or go and get that. If reinforcement always happens away from you as the person who's trying to target and change behavior with this child or individual, then they're going to see that I always need to get away in order to get reinforcement. So, for example, if you're saying, all right, buddy, excellent sitting, go over and get that, and then you walk over and go, oh, what are you playing on the computer? You might see your child or student going, move away from me, right? I'm in reinforcement. What we have to think about is we want to be seen as the person who gives good stuff, right? We want to be seen as that person who is really paired with those good things, because as we know, working with individual with developmental disabilities, we might see ourselves going, sit, don't do that, put your hands down, come here. And we're throwing a lot of demands and redirections at students or individuals. And so we have to think about, am I paired with reinforcement, or do they look at me as that individual who's constantly redirecting and placing demands? So we need to think about that pairing. The other thing we have to look at, excuse me, is our proximity. Are we around, kind of with that pairing with the reinforcement? Are we close to those individuals? And are we around when they contact that reinforcement? And then the last two we're really looking at is labeling. If we're working with individuals, children, students who don't have a lot of language, one of the things that we want to work on is labeling the reinforcer as they're contacting it. Excuse me. So, for example, if we have an individual who has limited to no language, and we provide them with a gummy bear for brushing their teeth, then what we want to think about is when they contact that gummy bear, we're saying gummy bear, because what we want them to hear is the word that's paired with the reinforcer they're getting. So in the future, if they want a gummy bear, they know the term to actually label it and request it in the future. So we want to look at also them understanding what they're actually getting. So labeling those items. So in the future, if they want to sit down, or, they want to go to their beanbag, if they want to ask for a sticker, if they want to ask for a break, that once we're labeling those items as they're contacting those reinforcers, that in the future they've heard that word paired with what they're actually getting, so that they can understand how to ask for it in the future. And then the last one is thinking about that expressiveness. We really want our demand voice to look a little bit different than our reinforcement voice, so that they understand when they're contacting reinforcement. I don't say that we all have to sound like a Minnie Mouse type of character, but we do want to think about how we sound when they're contacting reinforcement, so that they may know that they're contacting reinforcement. Some other things to consider are that thinking of those rules of reinforcement when we're using it. And one of those rules that we often talk about is that you cannot tell whether something is a reinforcer until you observe its effect on a behavior. And oftentimes when I'm working in school systems, we talk about this because we have classrooms that have this kind of classroom wide reinforcement system, and we see individuals that we go, if I tell him, for example, to clip down, it doesn't seem to affect his behavior. Well, if we're looking at that, we can't tell whether something is a reinforcer until we observe its effect on a behavior. So if every time you clip up, I give you a sticker, but it's not affecting your behavior, then obviously we can't call that a reinforcer. So when I hear individuals talk about reinforcement, I always talk about, well, are we still thinking about the target behavior we want to change? So if we're still looking at him to decrease hitting, or we're still looking at him to sit down with me when I read a story, or to come to the dinner table, if we're saying, I've used that reinforcement in the past and it doesn't work, then obviously we haven't really used a reinforcement system because we haven't seen its effect on that behavior. So again, that goes back to the importance of trying to determine what is reinforcing, because if we don't start there, then we're going to be using a reinforcement system and thinking that it works when we really don't understand what is reinforcing to this child, student, individual. The second rule is what is reinforcing to one person may not be to another. And I think all of us in here may say, I like chocolate, or I like, I don't like chocolate, or I like, chewy candy. I don't like candy at all. And so what we have to think about is we all have different reinforcers. And so to assume that a sticker will work for everyone we work with, or every one of our children, or this type of board will work for all of our kids in our home, or this type of system will work for everyone, we can't assume that is what is reinforcing to one will be reinforcing to all. The third rule is that to be effective, a reinforcer must occur immediately after. And we talked about that immediacy. We want to teach children, individuals, our students, that if I want to see this behavior happening, and when I see it, I'm going to reinforce it. And we need to show them that, what, you set this whole time, I'm giving you a high five. Or, you finished your worksheet, I'm going to give you a 2-minute break. And so we want to show that immediacy of it, that this behavior gets you contact with what you're motivated for, those reinforcers. The fourth rule is that reinforcement must be contingent to be effective. So thinking about the first then, and we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit as well, but understanding that it's contingent upon a behavior happening, right? So I'm reinforcing the behavior I want to see. And then the last one is when strengthening a new behavior, reinforce frequently. We want to make sure that we are reinforcing behaviors at a high rate. And I know a lot of you probably came with thinking of behaviors you want to change and target. And, if I do want my student to set, or I want my child to keep his hands to himself, or I want him to, you know, ride in the car without screaming, we want to think about, if I can get them, to be quiet, I want to reinforce that often. If I can get them to keep them hands to themselves, I'm going to reinforce that often at first, right? And then I'm going to gradually fade that reinforcement system out, um, or gradually fade that to not happening constantly. But we have to think about, if we want to strengthen new behavior, we're going to have to reinforce pretty frequently, because those are new behaviors in this student or child's repertoire. So we want this to continue. So within that, now that we've kind of determined those reinforcers, and we've understand the rules, and we've looked at some of those considerations in reinforcement, what is the next step? And so we talked about this a little bit, but I want to put a big emphasis on this again, is that we want to really think about pairing yourself with reinforcement. If you've ever heard me speak before, I was an early educator. And one of the big things I did in my classroom was I had me and my staff wear purses. And we had shoulder purses that we wore. And the reason that we did that is we had a high rate of individuals on the autism spectrum in my classroom. And one of the things that I talked with my one staff member about doing is, I said, we're going to wear purses or fanny packs. And she chose purses, which was fine. And I said, we're going to go to these home visits, and we're going to determine what these individual kiddos love. And so once we found that out, we went before school started and put these items in our purses. We had some kids who liked cotton balls, who liked, Walmart and Target ads. And one of the things we started when they would come into my class is we would freely hand out those reinforcers. We had some kids who came to us and had been in situations with behaviors that, where they were removed from classrooms, that when I was told I was getting them, oh my goodness, you're going to have a ton of behavior issues. And so one of the things I wanted to kind of eliminate was, I wanted to say, I'm going to start by pairing myself with reinforcement and my staff. And so when they walked in, we kind of freely handed out some things. One of my students, he walked in, put his backpack up, and I gave him a dinosaur. I determined from mom and from observing him that he loved dinosaurs. So, throughout the day, I told my assistant, just, give him dinosaurs throughout the day. And then, later on that day, he was following us around. And, it's like, exactly, we want to be seen as the person who's kind of the giver of good things at first, because we're soon going to be placing a lot of demands on these kiddos. So we want to think about, are we paired with reinforcement? And if good things come through you, your child, student, and client, they're going to want to be around you. So we want to think about, am I that giver? And if not, if I'm always the person kind of redirecting and placing demands, then they're going to find that reinforcement somewhere else. So we want to be reinforcing to those individuals as much as possible. So as we pair, then we need to gradually fade those reinforcers and thinking about using them and how we're going to use them. And so one of those big things that we kind of talked about in the rules was, how can you use those reinforcers and make students and individuals understand that they have to kind of wait for them, right? You can't have iPad all day long, or you can't have these Cheetos at all times. You're going to have to start engaging in some behaviors in order to contact these, right? And this is where we think of behavior change. And one of the biggest things is kind of teaching contingencies. We want to teach individuals that your reinforcement is based upon you engaging in some type of behavior. So that's where we think about kind of that first then system. And one of the things that we can do is, first then systems are visual forms that provide a high motivation for the student to work through one activity to get to their preferred activity. So, when we have individuals that, I want you to sit here with me. I want you to point to things in the book. I want you, to fill out this application. I want you to get dressed in the morning. Kind of teaching them that those high motivation things will happen after you engage in something first. So it's contingent upon that behavior occurring. And this can be can be a very powerful strategy in maintaining appropriate behavior. And a lot of times people use these throughout transitions. So transitions from preferred to non-preferred, transitions in buildings, transitions throughout the home. But it's a very powerful tool to kind of think about how I can get you to understand that you can have the iPad or whatever your reinforcer is, but you have to engage in something first. So there are some steps to teaching this, and as I've seen this done in homes and schools and settings, a lot of times what I see happen is people think, oh, I just use this board and show it to my client or child, and they should understand how to use it. But one of the first steps is you identify those preferred items that you want the student to have or your child to have as the then. So, but when you first start, both of the things on the first then board are reinforcing. So you may have, M&Ms and an iPad. So first you have M&Ms, then you get the iPad. The reason you do that is because all too often I've seen people use this strategy and put something on the visual form of this, and it'll say, finish math homework, then you get M&Ms. Well, we've already determined that math homework is a behavior that causes them to engage in some possibly inappropriate behaviors. So we think that we just show them a picture of M&M, it's going to get them to complete their math homework. So one of the things we have to teach them is that this is something that if you do the first, you're always going to get the then. So we start with those two preferred items. Then as over several opportunities or days, whatever you're using it, then the first becomes a gradual kind of introduction to non-preferred tasks. So then maybe it's do this puzzle, then you get the M&Ms. Then it may be, then you do this math homework, then you get the M&Ms. So it's teaching individuals that you have to first finish this activity, then you get the then. So, and it's also teaching that reinforcement doesn't come all the time. So we're talking about how to gradually fade that. And these are some examples of these types of first then systems. This was one that was used in a school system, but first seat work, then we get a break, kind of taking actual pictures. And again, I had to teach that this was after the student knew the system, so teaching them when reinforcement's coming. This was a student who was asking break, 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 when do I get it? And so we wanted to teach them that, first you do this, then you get this activity. So it makes them start to understand contingencies. And one of the great things is this student in particular now has a lot of language, and one of the things he'll do is negotiate using the system. So first I do this, then I get this. And so he uses that type of language. So it teaches individuals that contingency and understanding that you are going to contact reinforcement, just not at this moment right now. These are other types of kind of systems that look like that. A system right by their name so they know where to access it and can access it throughout the day. The other type of system that can kind of teach you how to use reinforcement, but to gradually fade it to where they're understanding it doesn't come all the time, is those types of token systems. And one of the big things is I've seen token systems introduced a lot. And I've seen them used for households, for school systems, for other agencies. And one of the things that we have to think about is there needs to be major components when we're teaching individuals how to contact reinforcement and how to what they need to do to contact these reinforcers. And one of the things we have to think about is having a specified list of target behaviors. I've been in systems that use token systems, and they have like 6 or 7 behaviors that the student has to engage in order to get a token. And that's really not fair if we think about it, right? And it's not something that's probably going to be effective in changing behavior. So we have to think about looking at a target behavior. And so, you may have one that you're going to target using a token system. You may have 2, but we might want to think about, if he's setting, not screaming, and he's setting, then he's going to contact a reinforcer. Or, if he's not touching his sister, he's going to contact a token. What are those things that we're going to target here? And if we target too many, this system's not going to work because they're never going to come into contact with that token to exchange for that big reinforcer that we've determined is so reinforcing to them. So the other thing we have to think about once we know what behaviors we're going to target is tokens or points that participants can receive for emitting those targeted behaviors. And so we have to think about what are those things we're going to use. And we're going to look at some different type of token systems that I've used in the past to kind of determine what they look like, or how are they going to be reinforcing? Are they going to be durable? Are they going to be something that the individual wants to work towards? And then the last thing is a menu of backup reinforcers, preferred items, activities, or privileges that the child can obtain once they contact all these tokens. So then, as we have determined those 3 questions and we know those answers, then we're going to think about the skill level of the learner. And then we need to think about these general steps of introducing a token system. So you're going to describe how this system works. You're going to model the procedure for token delivery, and then you're going to model the delivery for exchange. So if you look at these steps, all of this talks about is modeling. And a lot of times in these systems of kind of fading out reinforcement and introducing these types of systems, people have said, well, it's not working. They don't understand how they get these backup reinforcers. And it all goes back to, are we modeling the procedure for token delivery, and are we modeling the exchange? And if not, then we're going to have issues with them understanding what this token system is. So I wanted to show you some sample ones that have been used in the past in situations I've worked in, and also through pictures that we've kind of seen in classrooms and in home settings. Obviously, if you're looking at the one to the upper left, this kiddo loved Angry Birds. So again, we use their interest within their token system. And so, they had to get so many tokens for their targeted behavior of Angry Birds, and then they could contact what they really wanted. You can also buy some that are already made, like the one to the top right. Those are pre-made. They use stars. Obviously, we want to think about the individual learner to what we're going to use. Some individuals can use actual pennies. Some people can use more of the laminated stars to the bottom right. And those can be interchanged if you make different pictures throughout the day to select what a student or child or client loves. The other thing you could do, and we use this a lot with individuals, is once you determine those reinforcers, you can kind of make a type of puzzle system using those tokens. So for example, if you look to the top right, we had an individual who loved dinosaurs. So one of the things we did for his reinforcement system was he would select what dinosaur he wanted to work for that day. And so we had already pre-cut several types of dinosaurs and laminated them. And so throughout the day, we had the list of targeted behaviors. So, and if he engaged in that, someone would give him a piece of the dinosaur. And as he got all the dinosaur pieces together, once the dinosaur was put all together, he can engage with that dinosaur. Just like the ones to the left, looking at the shark, looking at the computer, looking at the race car. All of those are pieces of a puzzle, and you have to start small. So again, when we think about reinforcement, we talked about contacting that reinforcement. And so we started with just the puzzle pieces being cut in half. So they only had to earn half of it. Then we cut it in thirds. Then we cut it in, 4 pieces. Then we went to 6. And as you could tell with the race car, it's in probably 20 pieces. So you can teach individuals how to kind of fade that reinforcement system. We have to the bottom right a child who loved the baseball field. So he earned all the balls to put on the bases, and once they were filled, then he got to look at baseball on the iPad. So thinking about how you can use those reinforcement systems to let them know things are coming up, and thinking about this for older individuals, we've had individuals who, want to work for a program on the computer. So on a whiteboard, they would earn the letters. So say, for example, they wanted to watch baseball. They'd earn a BASEBALL, then they get baseball. Thinking about those ways we could teach them that reinforcement's coming. It's just not going to happen immediately. And so when we're thinking about this, token systems are huge in the impact of teaching um, a child, a student, a client that, reinforcement's so strong, and we know you want that to come and you want that to happen, but it can't happen all the time. And so oftentimes if we're just telling them to wait, 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 and not showing them that it's coming, that may be something we need to do, is using those systems so they can understand how to exchange or how to contact all their tokens in order. Now I get my reinforcer. Now I contact that reinforcement. Now I can access my dinosaurs or cars or computer, whatever those systems are. So when we're thinking back and we're thinking over some of those things, we have to think about with reinforcement, we've kind of talked about how important it is. And I know a lot of us, when we think about those behaviors, as I've said, we kind of think about, I want him to stop doing this, or her to stop doing this, or I want this to be decreased. And one of the things I focused on throughout this type of conversation was all those reinforcement strategies to change behavior. And one of the things that we have to kind of change our mindset to think about is, if we have a behavior that we want to target to decrease, there's always a behavior that we need to target to increase. So that's why reinforcement strategies are so important. So for example, if I have a student or a child who I want them to stop grabbing at their sister, or I want them to, get up and get dressed in the morning, or I want them to stop staying in bed so late. There's always those behaviors that, I want to decrease, but on the other hand, there are all these behaviors that we need to target to increase. So reinforcement strategies are so important when we're thinking about how we can change behaviors, because now we can think about, once I know what's reinforcing, once I understand reinforcement strategies and how to use them, I can now look at, I need him to stop hitting, or to, stop running away, or to sit with me during these things. Though I need to reinforce these behaviors so that I could decrease these inappropriate behaviors. So thinking on these strategies is so important in looking at how to change behavior for students or children that we work with. So thinking back before we kind of, I take some questions, thinking back over to what we've kind of talked about today, remember that we need to determine reinforcers that are motivating to the child, the individual, the student that we're working with. It's so important to think about that. All too often we hear that these strategies don't work, but again, are we truly figuring out that this is a reinforcer for this individual? Also think about pairing yourself with that reinforcement. Are you seen as that person who is the giver of good things? If not, it may be that I can access everything good away from you. So are you really reinforcing to that individual? And again, I agree that we want to use these reinforcers, but in the back of our mind, we always need to think about, how are we going to gradually fade it out? We don't want individuals who are so dependent upon reinforcement. They can't engage and go on and be independent individuals without that reinforcement there constantly. So once we put these strategies in place, think about those things we talked about to kind of teach how we can fade reinforcement to look like it would in the natural environment, like paychecks or grades or things like that. And when we're determining those reinforcers, make sure we're allowing the child to make choices. They are the ones who know what's reinforcing to them. All of us are just assuming until we're doing those things to determine reinforcers. And remember, it's not called a reinforcer unless we look at its effect on a behavior. And so remember, thinking back to talking about changing behavior with individuals, we're constantly thinking about reinforcement theory. Reinforcement theory states behaviors that are reinforced are more likely to happen, right? So we have to think about those behaviors that we're targeting for change. So I appreciate you coming. So now I'm just going to open it up to a few questions, and I'll answer them out loud so everybody can kind of see if they have the same question, or if there are no questions, we'll wait for just a few minutes to see. Okay, it looks like there aren't any questions at this time. I'm going to go to the next slide and just leave my information right here. So this is my email address, laura.ferguson@louisville.edu, and there's my phone number. It's easiest to contact me by email. And if you didn't want to ask your question in front of everyone, or you wanted to think about this or go through the material and then ask questions later, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions or lead you in any direction that you need. But I appreciate all of you attending, and you are free to go. Thank you so much, and have a great day.